Welcome to The Explainer. Are we actually on the brink of World War III, or is the internet just feeding our collective anxiety? Today, we are breaking down the viral panic surrounding global conflict and looking at the actual evidence-based power dynamics at play. We're going to move past the sensational headlines and look at how military strategy, economics, energy, and geography are actually interacting to shape our global future. Let's kick things off with a pretty sobering quote from The Atlantic, which perfectly captures the public fear that a major great power conflict is somehow inevitable. It reads, "War between the US and China is more likely than recognized at the moment. Indeed, judging by the historical record, war is more likely than not." This really encapsulates the baseline anxiety of our era, doesn't it? It shows that the narrative of an impending, massive clash isn't just wild internet speculation. It's a very serious discussion happening among top policy and geopolitical experts. But we have to ask ourselves, how much of this is truly inevitable? Well, before we completely give in to the doom scrolling, we need to pause and ask what systemic incentives are actually driving global actors toward or away from total war. It's incredibly easy to see regional flare-ups on the news and immediately jump to doomsday conclusions. But to really understand the geopolitical board, we have to look at the underlying structures. We need to separate emotion from evidence and analyze the actual capabilities and constraints of these major powers. To do that, we'll follow this agenda. Section 1, the global conflict hypothesis. Section 2, history and the Thucydides trap. Section 3, energy and strategic choke points. Section 4, the financial warfare front. Section 5, technology and the space domain. And Section 6, assessing the real risks. All right, Section 1, the global conflict hypothesis, fact versus viral fiction. Let's look at a really striking number, 61. According to the 2026 U.S. Intelligence Community Annual Threat Assessment, there were 61 active state-based conflicts in 2024. That is the highest number since the end of World War II. It's a staggering figure, resulting in roughly 129,000 battle-related deaths. So the data clearly shows we are in a highly volatile, highly kinetic environment right now. But we have to be careful here. Does a high number of regional conflicts, even really severe ones, automatically mean a coordinated world war is starting? That question brings us to a stark contrast in how people analyze the situation. You have viral forecasters like Professor Jiang hypothesizing that the U.S. is intentionally engineering regional wars to save the petrodollar and establish what he calls a Pax Judaica. But on the flip side, official institutional assessments, like those from the intelligence community, frame this volatility quite differently. They see it simply as a rise in major power competition, proxy warfare, and regional instability. We have to weigh these differing theories directly against strategic realities. Moving on to Section 2, history and the Thucydides trap, patterns of power. Have you ever heard of the Thucydides trap? It tracks 16 historical periods where a rising power challenged an established ruling power. The result? War broke out 12 out of 16 times. So what historical precedent exists for our current situation? Well, when a rising power, like China today, demands a greater say in the global order, and an established power, like the US, feels its position is threatened, it creates immense structural stress. And the default historical outcome to that kind of stress has, unfortunately, been war. But here is the absolutely crucial point to remember. While history shows a dangerous pattern, a systemic transition does not guarantee a global war, especially if diplomatic and economic off-ramps exist. Look closely at that history again. 4 times war was actually avoided. The US and the Soviet Union navigated this exact trap during the Cold War without falling into direct, all-out conflict. It requires immense strategic balancing, for sure, but it proves that nations can navigate a power transition without destroying the world, provided the incentives to avoid mutual destruction outweigh the drive for absolute dominance. Which brings us to Section 3, energy and strategic choke points, the geography of power. Let's think about the geography of global shipping for a second, because there is a massive geopolitical vulnerability out there on the water. On one side of the globe, we have the Strait of Hormuz in the Middle East. It's a narrow waterway where roughly 20% of global oil and liquefied natural gas passes through. Iran can disrupt global energy markets simply by threatening to choke this single route. On the other side, we have the Strait of Malacca in Asia. China's entire industrial base is highly dependent on this corridor for its energy imports and trade exports. A U.S. Navy blockade here could theoretically cut off China's wartime energy, though it's worth noting it's jointly defended by ASEAN nations. These aren't just bodies of water, folks. They are the ultimate leverage points in a global struggle. So who actually benefits from this? If Middle Eastern energy is blocked via the Strait of Hormuz, Europe and Asia might be forced to rely entirely on much more expensive U.S. liquefied natural gas. That would severely shift the balance of economic power. In fact, some geopolitical theories suggest this could even be an intentional strategy to force the world's reliance on the Western Hemisphere and the U.S. dollar. Meanwhile, Europe is caught in a really tough spot, sandwiched between expensive American energy and sanctioned but very cheap Russian energy. The core takeaway here: energy dependency completely dictates foreign policy.
Now let's pivot to Section 4, the financial warfare front, economics as a weapon.
Warfare isn't just about kinetic military action anymore. The modern battlefield is highly financial. For example, removing a country like Russia from the SWIFT global payment system directly incentivizes the creation of alternative, non-dollar trading blocs among nations like Russia, China, and Iran. When you weaponize a reserve currency and free sovereign assets, the targets will logically try to build a system where that weapon no longer works. It's a classic cause and effect chain. Economic sanctions don't just punish a country, they actively force the restructuring of global alliances.
And that brings us to an eye-watering number: $39 trillion. Theorists point to this massive U.S. national debt as a primary driver for these financial actions. The argument goes that America is using financial coercion and energy dominance to basically force global markets to continue absorbing this debt. It's a fascinating perspective. If the global system shifts away from the U.S. dollar, the petrodollar, the American economy literally cannot fund itself. Therefore, maintaining dollar hegemony isn't just about hoarding wealth, it's viewed as an existential national security imperative. And that fundamentally alters how we interpret U.S. actions abroad.
Let's look up for Section 5, Technology and the Space Domain, the New Battlegrounds. As we shift away from traditional combat, we have to evaluate the non-kinetic domains. Get ready for a concept that sounds like sci-fi but is very real: the CRQC, or Cryptographically Relevant Quantum Computer. It's a theoretical quantum system capable of breaking current encryption methods that protect all our sensitive global finance and national security data. The 2026 Intelligence Assessment explicitly warns of a race to build a CRQC. What that means is the next global conflict could instantly compromise the entire global financial and intelligence infrastructure. Imagine the very first strike of a war not being a missile, but the complete decryption of an adversary's banking system. Absolutely wild to think about. And the technological front expands rapidly from there, with AI streamlining military targeting and China rapidly expanding its counterspace capabilities to contest U.S. dominance. A conflict could cripple global communications before a single ground troop is even deployed. Plus, the timeline for tactical adaptation and warfare has shrunk from years to weeks thanks to AI and uncrewed systems. We are looking at a future where conflict is highly automated, heavily dependent on space, and incredibly fast. Finally, let's wrap this up with Section 6, Assessing the Real Risks, Avoiding the Echo Chamber. Let's step back and look at the big picture. Academic consensus from institutions like the IJFMR points out that while the risk of regional war and proxy escalation is incredibly high, we see the proxy wars happening right now, a true world war requires a scale of direct superpower confrontation that all sides are deeply incentivized to avoid. Escalating to a direct clash between nuclear-armed, economically intertwined superpowers crosses a massive, unprecedented threshold. The destruction, both kinetic and economic, would be mutual and it would be absolute. So, as you're navigating the daily news and the doom scrolling, I want to leave you with this final thought. Whenever you hear a really bold prediction about the onset of World War III, always ask yourself what economic and geopolitical incentives are really driving that narrative. What assumptions must be true for this prediction to happen? Is it a grounded, evidence-based assessment, or is it a play for attention, influence, or even financial gain? Understanding the intersection of geography, economics, and technology allows us to see the board clearly rather than just reacting to the noise. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning and keep questioning.